and welcome to the first of 3 webinars on theological anthropology, or what it means to be human in today's language of faith. I'm Cristie Traina, professor of theology at Fordham University, and I'm here with my colleague Elsie Miranda, director of diversities at the Association of Theological Schools. We've asked prominent theologians to share their thoughts in a short book we've edited for Paulist Press, The Meaning of Being Human, Synodal Considerations on Theological Anthropologies. The book will come out in 2025, but in the meantime, we've invited the authors to talk about why this question is so important in this particular moment in time and to share their wisdom with us. We're grateful for the generosity of all our authors, to Paulist Press for their partnership in this project, and to the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College, and especially its director, Dan Horan, for making this webinar possible. Tonight, I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and Elsie will invite each of them to share their thoughts, and then the speakers will have time to converse with Elsie and each other. That will be followed by questions from you, our live webinar audience. To submit questions or comments, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar screen and not the chat button. So our wonderful guests include Ilia Delio, OSF, who holds the Josephine C. Connolly Endowed Chair in Theology at Villanova University and is the author of 20 books on theology and science. She's also the founder of the Center for Christogenesis. Dan Horan, OFM, is professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, where he also directs the Center for the Study of Spirituality. He is affiliated professor of spirituality at the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio as well, and has written over 14 books on spirituality and theology. Elizabeth Johnson, CSJ, is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Theology at Fordham University, and the author of 11 books and counting, many on feminist and ecological theology, including the most recent, Ask the Beasts. She has served as the president of both the Catholic Theological Society of America and the American Theological Society, and has mentored many current professors of theology. Todd Salzman is professor of theology at Creighton University, an author or co-author of 13 books with a focus on doing theology in the post-Vatican II Church. His co-author for the book is Michael Lawler, the Amelia and Emil Graf Professor Emeritus of Catholic Theology at Creighton, with whom he's also written 4 books and many articles on the ethics of sexuality. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for taking time to join our webinar. And now I'm going to turn it over to you and to Elsie.
Thank you, Cristie. So today we are in solidarity in some ways with the General Assembly of the Synod on Synodality, which started their retreat today in preparation for the second session of the 16th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, which will begin on Wednesday, October 2nd, and last through the 27th of October. All of our authors have, in one way or another, responded to Pope Francis's invitation from last year's synod to provide a new perspective on theological anthropology. So we're very grateful for their contributions and look forward to their insights that they will share with us tonight. And I'd like to just ask us all to take one brief moment of prayer to join in solidarity with the community in Rome and with all Catholics all over the world, seeking guidance from the Spirit. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Spirit of the living God, open the minds and hearts of our brothers and sisters participating in the Synod, as well as the minds and hearts of all those who participate in these conversations. Grant unto all of your church the courage to listen with humility, the wisdom to speak with fidelity to your infinite love, and the grace to recognize you in the simple and profound moments of our lives. Amen. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ilia Delio. Ilia, the title of your essay is Evolution Toward Personhood, and it has been delightful to read your works, not only this chapter, but many other works where you talk about evolution and really challenge us to think outside the traditional understanding of creation as set in a particular time period. So I invite you to share with us your thoughts and insights on this profound and new way of seeing evolution and creation.
Thank you, Elsie. This is a very important topic, and I'm really very happy to be part of this project because I think the human person today is standing in such a critical threshold as technology is quickly evolving us and our world. I was trained in medieval theology, and so I was taught with good Catholic theology as the human person being created with body, soul, and spirit. And I think those terms, those aspects of personhood are still hold true, but how we understand those aspects now, I think, comes under kind of new understandings with evolution and artificial intelligence. Teilhard de Chardin, who's a person I've been studying for many years, described the human person as a fact falling within the scope of nature. And I think that that starting point is very important for us. It's not quite explicit in scripture. We have Genesis and creation, but I think beginning with the human person as a fact falling within nature puts us within a long trajectory of unfolding life. Evolution here on Earth being about 4.2 billion years old, and the human person as we know person being about 140,000 years old. So we're relatively newcomers to this process of biological and planetary life, which means that what we are is a process of becoming. One thing that evolution has done is challenge the notion of original sin, upon which much of Catholic doctrine is based and oriented. Biological or original sin being, in a sense, that fall of Adam and Eve, but whether or not we want to keep original sin at the heart of our anthropology is a question. I think we can also understand the human person as one who is oriented towards something of the fullness of God and the fullness of life. So I think to realize that we're part of a larger process brings a massive change, actually, to all our knowledge and beliefs. We're part of nature, and yet we're something distinct from nature. And that question of distinction is really one that we're critically discerning today, especially not only because science has identified so much of what we are neurologically, psychically, physically, but AI now, if we watch the trajectory of AI, it's beginning to map human personhood in a way that we're building machinic-like persons, humanoids. And it's getting eerily close to what we're about. So what are we? What are we oriented toward? What are we in this ongoing process of evolution? It's an unfinished process, and therefore we have to begin to see ourselves as unfinished, and therefore not finished products that are fallen, but unfinished that are on our way to completion. And in this respect, I think Karl Rahner was a good interlocutor for the age of the 20th century. But I think Rahner's notion of human spirit as having this transcendent dimension to it also needs to be rethought within the context we find ourselves today, which is this kind of holonomic or interweb of life. What does transcendence mean in an age of technology, in an age of interdependence? And I think this kind of intrinsic relatedness that we're in allows us to rethink what it means to be image of God and oriented toward God. Because the question of the human person really is the question of God. And as we begin to reassess what we're about in evolution, so too the question of God must also be reassessed within the context of evolution. Which means that we're becoming something. This notion of soul is not a given. It is, in a sense, what we are becoming, what we're building. Teilhard de Chardin spoke of the soul as something that is a building process, which means personhood itself is not a given. We're moving, as we move through higher levels of consciousness and awareness of our own beingness within the wider scope of relationality. I think we ourselves are given the opportunity to choose. Do we want to remain individuals or partials, or are we part of something more whole than ourselves and therefore persons? So I take personhood as, I don't want to take it as a given, I want to take it as a question within this process of evolution. Namely, what are we becoming, and what are we oriented toward? I think these questions are extremely important right now because we've not always, maybe, excuse me, we've crossed the threshold in some ways from the modern person into the post-human. And post-humanity is redefining of what we are within this complexity of ongoing life, which includes machinic life, natural life, animal life. And therefore, I think the post-human versus the human also requires and calls us into rethinking, what do we mean by a Catholic notion of personhood? What does a Catholic post-human look like? And so maybe I don't have any answers to anything, but I do have a lot of questions, and I do think we need to pay attention to science. I think Catholic theology cannot marginalize science. It must engage science much more explicitly as a basis to understand what we are by nature and to understand how that nature is now undergoing radical changes and reorienting what we are as human persons in this process of evolution. I know that we have limited time, so maybe I should just stop there because we have 4 other speakers and we can open it up to questions later.
Your timing is impeccable. Thank you. The chimes just went off. Thank you so much, Ilia. In some ways, the essay that our sister Elizabeth Johnson wrote dovetails with what you have written. So I'd like to introduce Beth Johnson's essay, Human Beings Redeemed with the Community of Creation, and invite you to take your own trajectory into exploring the meaning of what it means to be human within this interconnected, broader cosmological view that you have presented. So, Dr. Johnson. Let's unmute you.
Here we are.
Yep.
Good. Thank you so much, Elsie. And as you said, my essay was entitled Human Beings Redeemed with the Community of Creation. Part of the traditional theological anthropology has always been the emphasis on sin and grace, and the grace being redemptive to our sinful and fallen nature, as Ilia was pointing out. And in our own era, it seems to me that theological anthropology has a crying need to re-envision our human selves, our human community, in connection with the rest of the natural world, not as something that we add on or by the way, but intrinsic. And if that's the case, then what do we say about redemption, about the traditional treatises on sin and grace, and on the role of Jesus Christ as Redeemer? So that was my focus on what we need to go forward to. Until recently, we in Western culture mostly defined ourselves apart from the broader world. We envisioned the world as a pyramid with human beings on the top, at the pinnacle, with the right to dominate other species and use them and so on. Unlike the alternative model would be a circle of kinship in which we are interconnected in a responsible position with all other creatures, instead of being above them with what we see now is disastrous results. I looked in my essay for two sources for how we could dismantle this pyramid and become more of a circle of kinship that would then give us a new way to understand redemption. One, of course, is theology, all the sources that we have. If you look at scripture, in Genesis, God creates everything and sees that it is very good. And all the way through up to Revelation, in which we have a new heaven and a new earth at the end. And so it's everything. It's not only all about us. It is about us, but we are integrated and part of everything else. Laudato Si did a beautiful job, I think, in putting that vision into contemporary language. And I just quote one line from that encyclical. Creation means that we humans are not disconnected from the rest of creatures, but joined together with them in one splendid universal communion. That's the vision. We're not there yet. You think of all liturgical prayers, you think of homilies you've heard, you think of the catechism. I mean, it's still mostly all about it, but there's a need for this wider sense of what community we are part of. So one great source is scripture and theological tradition. The other source is science. And I agree with Ilia very much so that more of scientific knowledge should come into our theologizing. There's a line I love to quote. It's not a line, it's a little section from Darwin's On the Origin of Species that shows our human connectedness biologically with the whole evolving tree of life. Darwin wrote, "What can be more curious than that the hand of a man formed for grasping, that of a mole for digging, the leg of the horse, the paddle of the porpoise, and the wing of the bat should all be constructed on the same pattern and should include the same bones in the same relative positions." And the reason, he says, is that an ancient progenitor had its limbs arranged that way, and all the descendants inherited the pattern. Over time, the bones might be enveloped in a thick membrane to form a paddle to swim, or a thin membrane to form a wing. Or they might be separated to form fingers and toes, but there'll be no tendency to alter the framework. And when he gets to that point in his own writing, he said, "What a grand natural system." So just a tiny bit of biology would show us our interconnectedness with other creatures, in this case, mammals. Also, chemically, we're of a piece with not only other living species, but with the planet that we live on and also with the rest of the universe. Arthur Peacock, a British scientist, once posed the question, why is our blood and the blood of most other animals red? It's because of hemoglobin, which contains iron. And as he put it, every atom of iron in our blood would not be there had it not been produced in some galactic explosion billions of years ago, and eventually condensed to form the iron in the crust of the Earth from which we have emerged. Now, again, chemically, in terms of physics as well, there's an interconnection of our very selves with the whole rest of the natural world that we've pretty much ignored in our theological anthropology. Now, as I said, my interest is on how this works out in terms of redemption. And is the good news meant for humans only, or is there good news for other creatures and the whole universe? The key text for me here is John's Gospel, the prologue, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, sarx, flesh. In theology today, the phrase deep incarnation is starting to be used as a shorthand because we know that human flesh is not self-contained. Every breath we take, everything we eat, our exchange with the natural world, human flesh is part of this great community of creation. So the phrase deep incarnation is starting to be used to signify that in the incarnation, there is a radical divine reach through human flesh in Jesus Christ into the very matrix of biological existence itself. Born of a woman, the Word of God became a creature of earth. The genes in his body were kin to the flowers, the frogs, the fish, the finches, the foxes, the whole evolving community of life. So by joining human flesh, the Word of God in Christ is connected not only to human beings, but to the whole biological world of living creatures and the cosmic dust of which we are all composed. Now, if you take that approach to the flesh that the world became, then when we get to the death of Jesus, we can see that it puts him in solidarity, not only with humans who die. We've always called on the death of Christ at points of our own death or the death of those we love, but in solidarity with all creatures who die. And then the resurrection, God bringing him into new life, signals good news not only for human beings, which it does, but for all creatures who share the flesh, the vulnerability to death, and the coming to an end. And we see this in the letter to Colossians that calls the risen Christ the firstborn of all creation. And I always say firstborn is not the only born, but the signal that the others are being born after him. Ambrose of Milan preached on Easter once a homily that began with these words: "When Christ arose, the earth arose." He had this vision that it mattered for all of the creation and for humans, of course, but for all the rest as well. So to conclude, we have so much work to do to expand our understanding of redemption to include all the others. Because for all our human difference, our shared identity, our kinship in this community of creation gives us a profound connection with the land, the sea, the sky, and also with all the other creatures, the horse, the salmon, the crow, the bee, the olive tree, and the stars, in one grand community of creation destined for joy, destined for blessedness. And that will give us a whole new framework for interpreting redemption and Jesus Christ as Redeemer. Thank you.
Wow. What a privilege it is to be here with all of you tonight. This is just fabulous. Both of you have really stimulated so much curiosity and theological imagination. And before we go to our next speaker, just a little bit of a reminder that we can take your questions in the chat now or in the at the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar screen, so that we're not tied up later. But again, thank you. I guess it's the spirit. So we're evolving in our thoughts and theological imagination to include the earth and all of God's creation and this deep incarnation in a whole new way, which Dan Horan, who is our next speaker, in some ways dovetails with what has been presented so far, but within the context of medieval theology. So Dan, your work entitled "God Creates in the Particular: Human Dignity and Diversity in Theological Anthropology" has given us much to consider and to reconsider, given our tradition. So without further ado, please, Dan Horan.
Thank you so much, Elsie, and to Cristie for organizing this project. It's been really delightful. I've been so engaged hearing our colleagues here present, and I think there's a natural progression, as you've said, that brings together all of these lines of thinking. And so I kind of want to, as we've zoomed out, as Professor Johnson invited us to think about our kinship with the whole of creation, I want to keep that in the back of our minds as we just zoom in for a minute about ourselves and what are the theological foundations, the philosophical and metaphysical grounding in which we, within the Catholic tradition, make claims about who we are and how God creates. So I want to begin with a couple questions that I open my chapter for this volume with. And this is actually not immediately about human persons, but there will be a connection here. I ask the reader, when God creates, does God first envision something generic and universal, or does God envision something individual and particular? For example, considering all the billions or perhaps trillions of blades of grass that grow on this planet, each created by and sustained in existence by God, what comes first in the divine creative act? Is it the idea of grass in general, or is it this particular blade of grass? And I invite us to think about how that same question could be posed, as Professor Johnson just suggested, about any other creature in the universe, that the more than human world, the non-human community of creation of which we are also a part, invites the same sort of question, right? In the amazing diversity of God's creation, how does God relate to us first and foremost? And so that line of questioning really begins to kind of uncover a concern that I have, and this is what I'm inviting us to think about in this book, which is, what are the foundations upon which we make claims about human personhood? And over the course of the Catholic Christian tradition, certainly in the last 800 years, and especially in the last 150 to 200 years, there has been what I would call a kind of anthropologic hegemony. There's been one particular school of thought, and that has, for the purposes of simplicity, we'll call this like a Thomist, a neo-Thomist understanding of human personhood and how God creates. In other words, when God begins the act of creation, God prioritizes the what of something. In Latin, the notion of quid or quidditas, the whatness of something. So going back to the example of grass, when God creates, God imagines grass as such, right? And then makes particular blades of grass, and using Aristotelian categories about accidental attributes and so forth, can say, well, this grass is not that grass because there's two instead of one, and they're not the same. And then location is important here, and size and history and weight and so forth. But the idea here is that what is shared in common, our common nature, is what takes precedent, what takes priority. When it comes to the human person, right, and this applies to all of creation, how God creates throughout the cosmos, but when it comes to the human person, there are lots of implications that follow from that way of thinking, with that simple sort of presupposition. One of the problems that starts to surface is the problem of diversity and the problem of difference that exists in our world and within the human family as part of the larger family of creation. So what I propose in this chapter is an invitation to go back to the sources, what the theologians and bishops of the Second Vatican Council called ressourcement. Let's go back and look at our tradition and see if there aren't other perfectly legitimate, perfectly orthodox philosophical and theological resources that can help us think through some of these questions. And one of those resources that I propose is the work of Blessed John Duns Scotus, a late 13th century Franciscan philosopher and theologian who had a very different approach to thinking about creation and what they called in the Middle Ages individuation. What makes this person, and not that person? What makes this blade of grass, and not another? And he said that when God creates, and here I'm kind of again oversimplifying for time, when God creates, God first envisions the particular, this particular individual, Elsie Miranda, Elizabeth Johnson, right? Dan Horan. When God creates, God imagines us and knows us first and loves us into existence. Scotus believes we do have a common nature. We have things that we share in common, but that when it comes kind of on a metaphysical level, on an ultimate level, to how we relate to our creator, what is primary is our particularity. And so whereas the other school of thought prioritized what's called in Latin quidditas, the whatness of something, Scotus says that in this framework, God prioritizes the hakcheitas, or the thisness, the particularity of something. And this has lots of implications. If we start to think about theological anthropology, what it means to be human, what does it mean to be somebody who embodies inherent dignity and value, who reflects the image and likeness of God in our particularity amid our diversity, sharing in common not only our likeness to the human family, right, in that one common nature, but also our likeness to the whole cosmic family, right, God's community of creation. Then all of a sudden we can see opportunities for the the goodness of diversity, the particularity, the individuals that exist in the world, not as something other, not as something outside, not as something abhorrent or disordered or different, but actually part of God's diverse and loving and inclusive community. So there are obviously, as I've mentioned already, implications that flow from this, but I think the key thing I want us to think about, what I want to invite us to think about in this synodal series of conversations about the meaning of human personhood, is that there are a diversity of theological resources that are as legitimate, as orthodox as Thomas Aquinas, for instance, or the Neo-Thomism that has been inherited in the centuries after his death. And that if we are people who are faithful to the Spirit, we can work together as a faith community and as a theological community to think about grounding our discussions of human personhood and identity, not only in a more robust, scientifically grounded and psychologically grounded and social science grounded dialogue, as Professor Delio and Johnson have pointed out, but also within our own theological tradition. So there's a lot more to say, but I know we have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of time, rather. So I'm gonna leave it there. And my closing remark is simply to say that there's more than one way to do theological anthropology. There's more than one way to be orthodox and in keeping within the tradition.
Bravo. Thank you so much. It is sheer grace that we keep interconnecting our thoughts and reflections here tonight. And we're not even done, because Professor Todd Salzman is also going to, in some ways, take what has been shared so far this evening and share with us his perceptions and research on complementarity and human dignity, correction of confused Catholic doctrine. So without further ado, Professor Salzman, please share with us your insights, and we will prepare for a robust conversation afterwards.
All right. Sex is always a good way to end the discussion in terms of the insights and to launch into a passionate discussion about these issues. First of all, just to recognize Michael Lawler, who I collaborated with. Cristie mentioned that at the beginning. What we wanted to explore in our essay is a fundamental question of sexual anthropology. Ronner years ago talked about theology is anthropology. That anthropological turn is really crucial, especially in all the areas discussed, but in sexual ethics in particular, because many have challenged the doctrinal teaching of the church on sexual ethics, which is grounded in a certain anthropology. So in order to address some of the questions, concerns, and disagreement with those teachings, we have to look to sexual anthropology to deconstruct the traditional anthropology in order to reconstruct it and draw out the doctrinal implications from that. So Catholic sexual anthropology, we begin our essay explaining that. It's especially articulated with Pope John Paul II and his introduction of the idea of complementarity. Complementarity argues that as individuals created in the image and likeness of God, we're complete individually, as Dan pointed out. We evolve in human understanding and we develop, but as a couple, we're incomplete, and we only become complete as a couple through the complementarity of male and female. And so anthropologically, the foundation of Catholic sexual ethics is a strict sexual binary where male and female come together to create a two-in-one flesh. Now, the question is whether or not that's an adequate anthropology, because all of the doctrines follow from that, whether it's regarding same-sex relationships, non-reproductive sexual acts within heterosexual relationships, the prohibition of artificial birth control, prohibition of reproductive technologies. So Catholic sexual anthropology depends on the truth of that claim about that strict sexual binary and the intrinsically between sex and gender. There have been several challenges to that anthropology, and I just want to name a few of those and then articulate our proposal for a more holistic anthropology that's inclusive of LGBTQ people especially. So some of the challenges especially have come out of the synodal process up to this point. A number of synodal reports from bishops' conferences throughout the world have really expressed frustration with Catholic sexual teaching and disagreement with that, and also the alienation of LGBTQ plus people from the church. Cardinal McElroy in San Diego calls for radical inclusion of LGBTQ people, and there's a real alienation in terms of the church's language towards people objectively disordered to refer to their orientation, for instance. The cardinals, bishops, lay people have called for change based, as Beth and Ilia and Dan pointed out, the importance of science to inform our sexual anthropology is really crucial. Experience is crucial as well. We talked about the source of ethical knowledge, and all of these should inform our sexual anthropology. And too often we ignore science when it doesn't affirm Catholic sexual teaching. Laudato Si is a perfect example of a good use of science, but there's a disconnect in Catholic use of science, which both Pope Francis and Pope John Paul II have emphasized are crucial for doing theology. But when it comes to sexual ethics, we don't want to incorporate science if it challenges those fundamental norms or doctrines of the church. So several cardinals, bishops, especially in Western Europe, and in the US, many of them have called for an evolution in how we think about sexual ethics and the anthropology underlying that sexual ethics, and have said that it's too simple and it doesn't reflect the actual lived reality of people in relationship. Some of the other challenges to that traditional anthropology, Pope Francis has supported same-sex civil unions, and so he's not challenging Catholic sexual teaching on marriage as a sacrament, but he's incorporating Catholic social teaching that calls for respecting human dignity and the legal recognition of same-sex unions. He's called for the blessing of same-sex unions and fiducius supplicans, which is met with a lot of resistance, but there's a fundamental recognition of the goodness of human beings and the importance of relationship that prioritize relationality over biology. Pope Francis has invited theologians to be open to the voice of the peoples, quoting him, popular theology needs to address mercifully toward the open wounds of humanity and of creation within the wounds of human history. That includes theologians privileging knowledge derived from the common sense of people. And again, the Sensus Fidelium, there was just a Pew study that came out in Latin America. 80% of Catholics don't accept Catholic teaching on contraception. They support the possibility of women priests, which is also grounded in fundamental anthropology there, both with marriage and ordination. There's a certain sexual anthropology driving those doctrines. Amoris Laetitia opened the door for a paradigm shift anthropologically, emphasizing conscience, discernment, and virtue rather than doctrines that are often used to cast at people, especially in the area of sexual ethics. So our proposal fundamentally is for revised theological anthropology, sexual anthropology. We argue for holistic complementarity that recognizes biology as a dimension of the person, but not a definitive dimension. We emphasize relationality, spirituality, emotional, psychological dimensions of the human person, and certainly sexual orientation is part of sexual identity. We would argue that it's objectively ordered, not objectively disordered. And if it is ordered, then we have to rethink the theological anthropology that's at the foundation of Catholic teaching, and out of that develop doctrines in line with that revised and reconstructed theological sexual anthropology. And so Pope Francis has opened the door for that anthropologically and methodologically in ethics, and now he's inviting theologians to move the church forward in thinking about these issues. And certainly synodality has opened up that possibility for lively discussion and an evolution in Catholic sexual anthropology and the norms and doctrines that flow from that. So that's our proposal, and it ties in well with the other speakers in terms of individuality, in terms of evolution, and in terms of redemption. So I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. You are all so faithful to the time. It's as if you were Swiss. This has been fabulous. I just want to point out the interconnected nature of every single one of your essays, and in some ways, I think we could say that we're exploring the evolution of Catholic theological anthropology together, and the challenges that kind of holding on to this Thomistic hegemony around anthropology is really inviting all of us to think more broadly about how we understand ourselves as a part of creation, and our interconnected relations and responsibilities, and how that's also inviting us to think about the meaning of being human within the broader scope of the universe. So to lead us into our kind of questions that have been provided to all of us by the participants, I'm going to bring my colleague in this project back, Cristie Traina, who has been taking notes of the questions being asked. Is that accurate, Cristie?
Yes, I think here I am. Okay. There's some wonderful questions in the Q&A, and I want to add also that we have had two terrific theologians join us to make comments in the Q&A, Jessica Koblenz and Therese Birch. So thank you both for being with us. One question that I think really does tie all of these together, both of them two do, but one of them is that it's terrific and important to incorporate the insights of contemporary science into our theological anthropology. At the same time, we know that in the past, science has either been dangerously wrong about some things or has been used in dangerous ways against people. I'm thinking the question is thinking about eugenics, psychology's pathologizing not only of LGBTQ folks, but of people who are asexual. And we can think of all of the science of race, right? That has led to such terrible discrimination and oppression of people of different backgrounds. So how do we use science, but critically?
Maybe I can start, since I think a lot in this area. First of all, I don't think science gives us truths. I think science gives us an approximate knowledge of what is of nature. And so I would refrain from using the term scientific truths. Second is that, like any discipline, science is an ongoing investigation of understanding what is reality. And so there are many different schools within every single discipline, whether it's evolution or quantum physics or consciousness studies. So I think one thing that I want to kind of invite us to is wider reading of science itself. I I get a little nervous, quite honestly, when we highlight certain things and then we kind of have fixed ideas around them. We really have to read quite widely in these areas. For example, evolution itself is not a homogeneous term. Today, even Darwinian evolution now has been updated with genetics and even updated from there with complexity studies, and now is also being discussed in terms of the way mind and matter or panpsychism is again shifting our understanding of evolution. So I think in theology, we tend to limit our, our access to science and then have a few things and then we draw these major conclusions on it. So yes, certainly eugenics and anything that gets distorted and used for purposes other than the pursuit of knowledge, such as eugenics that went awry, is not very healthy. But theology is not a naive subject as well, nor a naive area. Things have gone awry there as well. So I think both theology and science have had their dark moments. What we're seeing here is there needs to be a fundamental understanding of nature. In the Middle Ages, what we call science today was natural philosophy. And so, we're not asking ourselves to do anything different, but pay attention to what existence is, what is the real, or how can we approximate our knowledge of the real? And this impinges on theology itself. We can't talk about God as being, if being is what existence is. Well, what are we talking about? And I find our language and metaphors sometimes really quite all over the place, and they're kind of spanning from, yesterday into today and tomorrow. So I think for consistency purposes, what kind of sciences are we drawing from? How do we evaluate those sciences in light of our doctrinal claims? And then how can we reevaluate those claims to kind of shape our lives for the future?
Can I just pick up on one thing that Ilia highlighted that I think is worth noting too, about how theology has gone kind of off the rails at times as well in really destructive ways. And I think all four of the summaries that were shared touch on this. I'm thinking, Todd, your points too about how in sexual ethics, this has really been seen in detrimental ways, particularly to communities that don't conform to a kind of normative, singular, static view of what it means to be human, right? Human as either conceived as male or human as conceived as female in very strict binary ways. And I think, not only eugenics, but we can go back to the Western European colonization of what are now the Americas, and the way that native peoples who are encountered here were considered less than human, or to use the Aristotelian terrible language, natural slaves. And again, this is using theology, using philosophy to justify, in a pre sort of natural scientific era, to do a lot of the same damage. And I think the reason I bring this up is because a lot of as I think, Todd, you said very well, like the foundations of sexual ethics are rooted in this kind of theological anthropology. This is why this question is so dire, because it has really practical implications. And if we ignore, as Ilia was saying, the discoveries of science as vehicles, as pathways to better approximate the world that we live in with an ever-growing sense of complexity and understanding and knowledge, then we're just repeating the errors of the past, and that's really dangerous.
Just a quick example of this, it's quite stark. The church teaches not unjust discrimination against LGBTQ people, and the bishops, USCCB, had issued a statement about opposing non-discrimination legislation for sex couples to adopt or foster. And in their letter to Congress, they cite two studies, scientific studies, by two social scientists that have been totally critiqued and debunked as scientific knowledge that same-sex parents do damage to children in their upbringing. And so that's a good issue when it comes to sexual ethics. We're COC and its science of climate change, for instance. So to your point, Daniel, is well, I mean, theology have to be in an ongoing dialectic, but science is not truth, but it should inform us. And in that ongoing dialectic of anthropology and the doctrines that we derive from that.
Thank you. We have also some other questions in the chat, and I can see right now that we're not going to get to all of them. So my apologies in advance to everyone who has put an amazing and insightful question into the chat. One thing that comes up with an evolutionary theology is painful change, death, suffering. In an evolutionary view of the world, some creatures die to be food for others, other species go extinct to make space for the new ones. How do we think about death and suffering and their connection or lack of connection to sin if we have an evolutionary interrelated understanding of human personhood?
Again, I think the question is twofold. I mean, I should let Beth talk, but I think for one thing, we would not be here were it not for about 99% of the species before us that, in a sense, perished. And it's not that the sacrifice of non-human life is necessary for human life. It is that it's a finite contingent universe, and therefore, for the resources of life to flourish, there needs to be a release of life into more life. And that's, in a sense, putting death in a very nice way, that we die, but the death of any species is the release of that, the elements of that organism into the ongoing complexification or emergence of life, because evolutionary emergence actually builds on resources, in a sense, giving way to more life. So I don't take natural death as part of sin. In other words, I don't think the natural world, sinned and then they died. I do think when we come to the human species, and therefore the emergence of higher ordered consciousness and the capacity to make decisions for or against the good of the whole, then we do have a level of sin. And therefore, I think that death, and therefore I would take death not only on the physical level. I think death fans out on the human level to psychological death, moral death, physical death. And therefore, I think it is therefore how we begin to choose in this life. Death and life are not opposites. I think that's one thing that seems to be at play sometimes in the way the questions are asked. Death and life are two parts of the same whole. No death, no new life. That's basically how it goes. And I think the resurrection recapitulates that quite nicely, that what we're oriented toward is the fullness of life. But we can choose against that life. We can snuff out life by our choices. And therefore, in a sense, sin not only opposes life, it opposes death that actually fosters life. So it's a type of death, if you might say. But I guess I would want to see, kind of a reorientation of sin within the framework of conscious life and conscious decision making, and what we're oriented toward in terms of that wholeness of life, where death is part and parcel of that wholeness of life.
Thank you so much. It's by no coincidence that they put a Cuban in charge of the time. So I want to make sure that we have the last 5 minutes of our conversation. We want to give Beth the last word here before we close our webinar. So Beth, please.
No, I was just going to pick up on what Cristie's last question was and what Ilia was saying. The Apostle Paul did not know about evolution. How could he? And so for what he was seeing and his famous lines, sin came into the world, and with sin, as a result of sin came death. I mean, we cannot hold that literally any longer, because we just know that's not the case. There was death in the world, suffering and pain and agony and death long before human beings evolved to be consciously sinful. So the question becomes, again, a more cosmic one. I think the way Cristie was framing it, what do we do with the fact that the way it isn't just living creatures that die. I mean, every galaxy forms and then dissipates. I mean, stars form and have a life and then they die, and in their death, they cook up higher elements, and that creates more complexity in the universe, out of which other kinds of creatures can emerge, and so on. There is nothing that is stable forever. It's always coming into being and passing away. That's the law of, not just of our planet, but of the whole universe. So the question is, it's so in process, it's so becoming, it's unfinished. It's a narrative, and we're still going toward the future. And this is where I would come back to Jesus Christ in doing a theological take on this, that in Christ, God has joined this narrative, has gone down into the depths of death, and holds out the promise of something more. And that enables us to go forward with gratitude and joy, but also not in any way underestimating the agony of what happens. You know, when I was writing Ask the Beast, I was wrestling with predation, and I came across this beautiful line: they die into each other's life, they live from each other's death. This is when a lion goes after a giraffe. I mean, I watch nature programs on PBS, and it gets to that point and I go, oh, I can't watch this. I don't want to see the animal get killed, you know. But it's if that weren't happening, like Ilia said, there would be no other life. So to come to terms with that, not in terms of sin, but as the real way that the universe works, and that God is accompanying us every instant, every step of the way. I think that's as much as we can say, in all honesty. At least that's as far as I've gotten with this question.
So such a privilege to be together this evening and to contemplate these questions of beingness and whatness, and our constant evolution, making way and space for something new. So clearly we are all in the midst of our own unfolding and taking part in a broader unfolding and evolution of our own theological understanding of what it means to be human in the context of a broader understanding of what it means to be alive, and participate in the ongoing death and resurrection, redemption of nature. So thank you all so much for all the ways in which you have stimulated our gray matter. I wish we had more time to listen to some of the other questions that we didn't get a chance to attend to, but there are 2 more webinars that we have planned. So we hope to see you in a future moment, and let us continue to hold one another in prayer, and our synodal brothers and sisters who are in session for almost a month in Rome, that we might participate in that shift from a hierarchical model and paradigm of being to a much more circular and evolutionary one. So with much gratitude, I bid us all a good night, and much thanks.